In the 2012 election cycle, there were 90 million evangelical Christians in this country, social conservatives, those that share our values. Of those, 13 million were not registered to vote. And of those who were registered, 26 million did not vote. That has to improve. And today we're talking about tools to help churches improve their ability to impact their cultures. And Dr. Rick Scarborough is up in the studio, and he has an amazing new tool that will help churches be more effective in getting their folks registered and out to vote. Rick, tell us about this exciting program, Pastors2028.
Thank you, Tony. You took the words right out of my mouth regarding these candidates. It's refreshing to know that we have choices. But beloved, if we don't show up and vote our values, if we're not there, then we have no one to blame but ourselves. Seated to my left is a wonderful man of God that I had the joy of meeting quite incidentally back in about September, as I recall, but somewhere in the course of the year 2002. We were traversing the state of Texas with Rick Perry, who was running for his first term as governor in his own right. He had already been in the governorship for a couple of years when he took that role as our lieutenant governor when President Bush was elected. But he was running for his first term, and we were doing rallies to introduce pastors with a man who had a clear testimony of his love for Christ. We were using that tool to find access to pastors and to encourage them to lead their people to vote their values. We came to East Texas and bumped in, quite incidentally, to an attorney by the name of John Graves who just loved Jesus. He had secured the Republican nomination in a bid to become a congressman. In the course of putting together his campaign, he focused on mobilizing Christians. And so I say all of that to say, and John's going to say much more about it, what we're now doing in an organized fashion, we've created a tool that effectively does what John Graves was doing as a candidate for office. And so without more introduction than that, let me introduce to you my good friend, John Graves. John, I want you to describe, first of all, what does why the term Acts 2028, and then a little bit about it before we see a video.
Okay. Thank you very much. Sometimes in our lives when we're moving where we believe God wants us to go, it doesn't turn out the way we want it to, and we see later on what God was doing. And that's certainly true with what we're talking about here today. It's born out of a heart to serve pastors and to help them mobilize believers to be salt and light in our nation. And so I was running for Congress, as you mentioned, and what happened was I'd served several pastors and was close friends with several pastors of different denominations, and they had formed a prayer committee. And after that election was over, they were sitting around asking me, we worked so hard to mobilize our people, what do you think happened? And I just quoted the facts that Tony just mentioned, that half of Christians sometimes aren't registered to vote, and the ones that do, half of them don't vote, and they just didn't believe that. And one of them asked me, so that's just kind of the inception of this idea. They said, well, you have all that information? I said, yeah, it's public. You can go to the counties. It's cumbersome. It's a lot of work,
Correct.
But we had done the work. And so these churches asked me to run their membership list. And when we did it, they were stunned. And I was stunned that how few people were registered and voting. But what I learned from watching those pastors is they went into motion, because they each had a different denomination, a different leadership style. They did it different ways, but every one of them now had good information.
Information motivated them.
That's right. And so that's where the name came from, to answer your second question.
Well, give them the verse, though, Acts 20:28.
Acts 20:28, it says to pastors, be careful, be diligent to watch out for yourself and for your members, your congregation, your flock, that the Holy Spirit made you the overseer of. God cared enough about this to give the blood of His Son Jesus for this, and so That verse to me captures that this is an issue of a shepherd having good information to be diligent to know the state of his flocks so that he can steward them well or shepherd them well. And so that's where we came to the name. And we don't call it 2028 Initiative because it's not about what a pastor does. A lot of pastors, most of my closest friends are pastors, and it's not about what they do, it's about who they are. And when they understand there's not this political thing to stay out of, we're called to be salt and light. We're called to just be Christians in the government and the culture we find ourselves in. We get to elect who governs us.
Right.
And we just don't have good information. We have a lot of misinformation. And so this tool really removes the cumbersome nature, the difficult. They can go do this or figure out how to do this locally, but we can do this nationally now for pastors, and we do the hard, cumbersome, difficult work, but we just give them a good tool to motivate, and it's incredibly exciting to see what these pastors do.
You know, pastors, as you're going to see in the video in just a moment, when I was a pastor, I asked our financial secretary to give me a pie chart to show how many of our folks, I didn't want to know who they were, but how many of our people gave $5,000 or more? How many of our people gave $1,000 to $5,000 in the course of a year? How many people gave $100 to $1,000? And then how many gave less than $100? How many gave nothing? And I was shocked to discover the first time we did that over half of our congregation gave nothing. Now, what I did was I put that pie chart in our handout on Sunday morning, and I simply said to them, I don't know who falls in what category, but here's the shocking reality. Half of you aren't giving anything. Now, if you need a pastor for a time of death, if you've got a child that's in trouble, if you need us for any reason, whether you give $0 or give $10,000, we're going to be there because we love you. But once our people saw in black and white that pie chart and began to say, well, you know, I fall in this category, our giving went up measurably over the next couple of weeks. Now, effectively, that's what this tool will do. John, set the video up and then let's watch it.
This video will give you just a summary of what's required and why we're doing this and kind of our heart behind it. So would you watch this with us?
Gentlemen, if you'll cue up that video, let's watch that. I get excited just watching the video. We have This is a baby that God birthed. It was His idea, not ours.
Yes.
A lot of work went into putting this whole idea together. One of the questions pastors all over have has to do with privacy. Membership lists are sacred, and I want you to assure the folks the steps we take to make sure that there's no abuse of their church membership list, that we're careful and have a history now of handling these lists carefully with great privacy.
We've had zero issues. We've run a lot of lists. I think we're up to 8, 9, or 10 states now that we've run these lists. Churches, most of them are under 1,000. Several of them are over that. Some of them are over 10, 20,000. And we've got a very strict confidentiality agreement with a national data company. We follow all the protocols so that no one gets this but the pastor. And he doesn't get anything but the percentages of who's registered, who's voting in the last 4 elections, primaries all the way through.
Yeah, no confidence is betrayed, even in the
right.
report. You won't know who on your staff is voting and who is not. You'll simply know the percentages.
That's right. And one of the challenges that we, or resistances that we have sometimes is the pastors want to do this, and they go back and their elders or deacons or board or whatever. Unfortunately, we've learned that if one person is against it, it can overrule 5 or 7 or 10 other people. And so we try to give good information, again, to do what we do to serve these pastors. It's a free tool. They're not paying for it. It's a privacy issue, but we go one step further. You can't even get the list unless you also agree, because we don't think pastors would ever do this, but we don't want them to ever say, hey, I know you're not voting and you are. We want them to, shepherd.
And pastors, one thing we've discovered is that a lot of churches don't have good lists. They know that grandma is a member of the church, but when we start comparing it to the voter files, it's often hard to do. But the reality is we work hard. We have a whole staff now to clean that up and give you good information. Now, John, we have 3 minutes. I'd like you to share the story of Mark Andrews, because this will excite everybody listening.
Mark, it's exciting on a couple of levels. He is a culture impact team leader in one of the churches that we have served in North Carolina. And his pastor gave him permission. It's one of the things that we integrate the Acts 2028 project into culture impact team ministries, and the reason for that is 2 is better than 1. They have a better return for their labor, their profit. And so he was doing all the work for his pastor. Pastor Jake gave him permission, and he set up his culture impact team. We ran the list, and they got the report. And they were very happy as they sat around as a leadership team and said, well, their registration was way over the national average. And so they were really, really excited. And then they turned the report over, and a very low percent had turned out to vote in the last presidential election. So that's what the Culture Impact Team ministry person did, Mark Andrews. But what the pastor then did is right before the election, he stood up and put the chart in front of the congregation and said, "Who are we fooling? This is not okay. This is the real, similar to what you did."
In fact, he put it on the overheads.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And so they had a 30% increase due to their pastor taking a stand and being served by a Culture Impact Team leader.
In fact, folks, there were about 10 churches in that particular county that had cultural impact teams that did the Acts 2028 plan. And we were able to statistically measure an increase in voters that turned out that made the measurable difference in the outcomes of elections up and down the line. There's no way of overstating how important it is that we have good information, that we then turn our people loose with that good information to be salt and light. John Graves will work directly with your church and the people in your church that you assign the task. We will do it with the ultimate amount of care and concern for privacy. But if you'll help us, we'll help you. And who knows but what? We won't see that revival we're all praying for. In 30 seconds, John, a final word.
I would say the biggest thing here is Georgia Barna said if 10% of Christians get involved, it would sweep the White House, the Senate, and the Congress, because as Tony mentioned earlier, so few Christians are turning out to vote, and we're seeing 3 times that. So if pastors get behind this movement, it will influence and change the culture to be salt and light. The believers will impact this culture.
If you're watching this on Saturday morning, I know you care. help us make the difference in saving our nation. Tony, back to you.
Thank you, Rick. John, exciting. What an exciting tool that pastors can have. And of course, voter registration, voter turnout, a key component of our culture impact teams, but just one component.